Okay, I think we should get started. It's 7 o'clock and we have an hour. I want to welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Elena Rios, President of the National Hispanic Health Foundation, and we are in our clinical research webinar series. Today's webinar is called To Shape Our Future, Increase Hispanics in Clinical Research. And we have two outstanding professors, Dr. Salvador Cruz-Flores, who is a professor and founding chair at the Texas Tech University Science Center in El Paso in neurology, and Dr. Augusto Ochoa, who is the deputy director at the Louisiana State University LCMC Health Cancer Center. These two doctors have long careers and I'm not going to read bios. They can tell us more about their experiences as we get into the questions and answers. But they have long-standing careers in academic medicine, but more importantly, in research with Latino patients. And we're here to teach others about the importance of getting more Latino doctors and nurses and other researchers to get involved in clinical research and especially clinical trials with our partner today, the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development, EQB-MED. We're very interested in developing researchers for our communities. Just a few housekeeping messages. All participants' microphones will be muted. Please feel free to type your questions into our Q&A box at the bottom so that the panelists will be able to answer questions after the two presentations. The presentations will be brief so that we can have more time for questions and answers from you all. And then we will have a post-webinar survey that will be mailed out after the event and also shown on our QR code at the end of this presentation. The recording of the webinar will be housed on our NHHF website, which is nhhfx.org, and sent out 1 week after the event. It's my understanding that there will be CME instructions given to you with that post-webinar survey. So we want to have a happy Hispanic Heritage Month and let everyone know how important it is that we know we need more Latinos in medicine and all the health professions. But right now, according to the AMA, there are only approximately 6% of all the US physicians that identify themselves as Hispanic or Latino. So we're here to celebrate the talent that we have so that we can inspire those on the call and those listening in to think about telling others, especially those in STEM and, you know, students interested in math and science. You need to inspire them and encourage them to think about going into the health careers. Next slide. So the objectives today are really to understand the impact of clinical trial researchers. You know, I think it's important that you will have an understanding about the critical role that Hispanics play in clinical research. Number two is to discuss clinical research career pathways. Again, we have two doctors from two different parts of the country with different career pathways. So it's great to be able to exchange ideas with them that you might feel like it's your own pathway, and hopefully you gain some more confidence about how to get into careers in research. Number three is to review how to increase Hispanic community engagement. You know, the reason we do what we do, doctors are always trying to help their patients. And so in the terms of researchers, they're helping to encourage patients to get involved in research so that we can have more knowledge about the Hispanic health status and how disease affects, and not only disease, but medications affect our patients. And the last objective really is to increase awareness about EQB-MED, which is our partner to promote diversity in research. And I have to say that the participants will be learning about this pilot project which is a collaborative partnership to diversify participation in clinical trials with communities of color and rural communities by increasing awareness, addressing misinformation and historical mistrust, and ensuring that trials are easily accessible and sustainable. And I know that I serve on the advisory committee, and I know that the EQBMED is actually focused in the areas where our two speakers are in Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, the southeastern United States. So it's great to have you here. And next slide. So the National Hispanic Health Foundation mission, we have changed and we are rebranding ourselves. The mission now is to transform the healthcare system to advance Hispanic health equity through leadership, research, and education. And then more about us can be, you can see through this QR code here, more about us, and go to the website, nhhfx.org. And for meetings with me, you can contact my executive assistant. Next slide. The National Center for Hispanic Health Research is a project that we've been developing over the last few years. NHHF has actually developed initiatives. Our mission of the Research Center is to elevate the participation of Hispanic physicians, other researchers, and other health professionals in clinical research. And we really have been advancing two major initiatives. One is an awareness initiative to have databases about clinical trial principal investigators. We call them the senior researchers, and we are also developing the databases of the Hispanic students. Medical students, for example, could be nursing students, but students and residents and junior faculty. We actually just met with the AAMC this morning to help us on gathering that second database, and hoping to have an educational initiative, not only including these webinars, quarterly webinars, toolkits, but also mentorship for advancing careers in research, and of course, awareness about clinical trials themselves. Next slide. And about EQBMED, the, again, collaborative partnership to diversify participation in clinical trials in communities of color by increasing awareness, by addressing misinformation, and ensuring trials are easily accessible. Next slide. The network partners include Yale Medical School, Vanderbilt, Morehouse, and the RCMI system that is run through Morehouse School. And I have to say that it's been a great way to learn from each other, these networking partners. Next slide. And I think the whole goal here is to develop an ecosystem that really hasn't been developed. Three crucial components to the ecosystem driving us toward our goal of increasing minority participation in trials. One is to have partners, again, partners that are operational and community-based, partners that can develop more research awareness among the community. Then there's the sponsors, of course, who collaborate with the sites to shape official protocols for more inclusive clinical research and host trials aligned with community partners. The sponsors are usually pharmaceutical companies that provide the sponsorship for the trials that they need for approval of their medications as they go through their pipelines. And then, of course, the sites and communities, which are the most important part of this piece, is that the clinical trial sites need to have diversity in order to have knowledge for America, which we know is getting more and more diverse. And for us, it means having more Hispanics involved from our communities involved in clinical research, whether as the researcher or as the patient. And next slide. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Augusto Ochoa, and from LSU. Dr. Ochoa, if you want to say something else about your pathway, but I know you have a few slides, and we'll have questions and answers again after the two presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rios, for this invitation. I'm actually very excited to be here with my fellow Hispanic and Latino physicians and healthcare providers. I don't want to spend too much time telling you about my path. If we want to talk about it, we can talk about it later on. Okay. I'd rather share with you some of my experiences so you can see what we have done and how this might be applicable to many of the places where we participate in work. I called my presentation Expanding Access to Cancer Clinical Trials in Louisiana. And what I'd like you to take home from this is that, first of all, you don't have to be an oncologist to participate as a leader in cancer clinical trials. You can have many roles, starting all the way from family members to medical students, to nursing students, to nurses, to community healthcare workers. All can participate in clinical trials. And the second thing is that when we talk about clinical trials, we always think, or we used to think about 10 years ago, that clinical trials was a last-ditch effort for a patient who had already failed all kinds of treatments. And in today's world, there are so many drugs, successful drugs being developed, and so many new successful trials that cancer clinical trials are now part of the planning of the regular treatment of any cancer patient, and they should be talked about up front. Next slide, please. So if you look at Louisiana, when I started as cancer center director back in the mid-2000s, this was the picture. The dark colors you see around Louisiana, both in blue and dark red, simply show that we have a very high incidence and a very high mortality of cancer in our region. And this includes all populations. However, the African American population is the most highly impacted in our region. Next slide. Here we go. So one of the things that I started saying that we can all participate in cancer clinical trials is because one of the things that we know in the United States is that 80 to 85% of all adult cancer patients in the United States are seen and treated in community hospitals, not in the large cancer centers. But the other unfortunate part is that 90% of adult cancer patients do not participate in a clinical trial and therefore do not have access to the latest and greatest. Clinical trials are where patients have access today to the drugs that are going to be approved tomorrow. The other problem we have is that those big cancer centers that we talk about that are so important, like MD Anderson, for example, or Memorial Sloan Kettering, are very far away from the majority of cancer patients, and therefore cancer patients cannot afford to be there and cannot travel to be there for their regular treatments. And so many patients, especially those that are minority and underserved, have very few options to participate in these trials. Next slide. But if you ask a patient, in the past we thought, well, patients don't want to participate in a clinical trial, but that is not exactly correct. If you ask a patient and say, we're going to offer you a possibility of participating in a clinical trial that might give you an opportunity to have the latest and greatest treatment, the answer almost all the time is, I would love to do it if, number one, it is recommended by the doctor I trust, who is my local doctor. And number two, I would prefer to do it closer to home so I don't have to drive all the way to those centers far away to cities that I do not know. Next slide. To do it in community sites, we had to change the model that we have traditionally known. Next slide. So instead of having the access to a very big academic cancer center, we needed to make this so that patients could have treatment closer to home. And for that, we needed to work with community hospitals or with private community clinics to make this a more patient-centric, patient-directed treatment and process. Next slide. So to do that, we started building a coalition of the largest hospital systems in Louisiana. These 5 hospital systems and academic centers came together, and over a period of 10 to 12 years, we've slowly built out this coalition. And we call it now the Gulf South Clinical Trials Network, and it is funded by a National Cancer Institute program called the NCORP. Next slide. And through that system, we have now built 49 sites. Not all of them are listed here. 49 sites in the state of Louisiana and now parts of Mississippi and Alabama. Next slide. And the important part of this is that we have now learned that 10 or 15 years ago, we were only thinking of treatment trials, like you see on the left-hand side, where we test new drugs and new forms of treatment. But the important part of this is that we know that the way of appropriately treating a cancer patient is looking at all aspects of their treatment. We have to start with prevention and control. We have to find out how to best deliver treatment to the patients. If patients complete their treatment, they have to go on to survivorship programs. And we also have to understand how cancer care is creating some health disparities. So when we talk about clinical trials or cancer clinical trials, it's not just treatment trials, it's all of this variety. And the only way we could deliver something like that was to create this coalition of different hospitals with different strengths that could provide access to patients to this multiplicity of trials that are available to them. Next slide. And so what this resulted back is you can see in the blue bars are the numbers of patients that we enroll now about per year. So we started somewhere in 2009, 2010, we were enrolling about 120 to 140 patients altogether in the state of Louisiana on cancer clinical trials. And as we came together in this program that we call the NCORP, as you can see there, initial NCORP and renewal, you see that as we came together, the numbers of patients increased, and we now enroll about 10-fold higher numbers of patients throughout the state of Louisiana. We now top about 1,500 patients per year consistently since 2018. And that yellow line you see over there is the number of the percentage of participating minority patients. As you can see, we went from a low of about 25%, mostly African-American patients, to now about 55 to 60% of our patients are minorities, including African-Americans, and a small number of Hispanics that are part of our population in Louisiana. Next slide. One of the things that we encountered was that patients were being enrolled in the larger cities, but patients in the smaller community hospitals or in the community clinics, especially rural clinics, were not being enrolled. And when we were looking for the reasons for that, when we talked to the doctors, everybody said, we'd love to do it, but we do not have a research infrastructure. In other words, we don't have the research nurses. They're too expensive and too few in their state. We don't have the regulatory infrastructure to manage our clinical trials, and we don't have the data managers. And so we decided to test something back in 2017 that was developed by our lead research nurse, Eileen Medeiros, that we call now the virtual research nurse. And through this approach, using virtual means, back in 2017, Zoom was not really well known, but we still tried it. And using that approach, the doctors in the smaller community sites were able to choose some trials that they thought were important for their patients. Our nurses screened their clinics, the patients who were coming to their clinics ahead of time, and on Fridays before the clinic started of the following week, the nurse would inform the doctor of which patients might be good candidates for a trial. In the second part of this slide, you see the doctor talking to the patient and offering the participation of a clinical trial if they were interested in it. And if they were interested, then the doctor would turn on the computer, turn around the screen, and our nurse that was located here in New Orleans would then help the doctor enroll the patient, would work with the facility to make sure that they had all the medications, the infusions, all the tests that needed to be done. And then the nurse downloaded an app onto the patient's telephone so that they could follow up with a virtual nurse. And even though they would be going back to their home that was close to this clinic, the patient could easily contact back the research nurse and ask them questions, because that's one of the problems that most patients get lost when they have questions and they cannot contact the treatment team. Next slide. And so this has attracted a lot of attention from the National Cancer Institute, from the federal government. And as you can see here, last year, the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, came to see how the virtual research nurse program worked. And what you're seeing in the screen there is our team in Gulfport, Mississippi. On the smaller part of the screen, you see Dr. Pamela Tooley, who's our oncologist at that site. And on the left hand of the screen, you see the nurse, what we call the nurse facilitator. They help with the managing of the patient, but our nurses who are centrally located in New Orleans are the ones that manage the whole program. Using this program, just in a couple of rural sites, we have screened over 3,500 patients now and have enrolled over 150 on clinical trials using the remote program called the Virtual Research Nurse. Next slide. So I'd like to once again thank Elena Rios for this invitation. I hope that we have lots of questions and lots of discussion at the end of the session. And I hope that I was able to tell you that many of us can participate in cancer clinical trials, and we do not all have to be oncologists to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ochoa. Next, we have Dr. Salvador Cruz-Flores, who's from El Paso, another part of the Latino landscape, and especially the EQBMED focused area of Texas. Dr. Cruz-Flores.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'd like to thank Dr. Elena Rios for the invitation. Actually, for a long time, I've been trying to meet you. At some point, I was trying to become a member of the National Hispanic Doctor. But anyway, that's a different story.
Well, we'll continue to work together through this project.
I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to speak briefly about my experience. First of all, I'm Mexican in origin. I'm from Monterrey, Mexico, and I transplanted to the United States back in 1992. I spent my first 21 years in the U.S. in St. Louis University in St. Louis. There, I trained again in neurology, and then became a stroke doctor, neurointensivist, and became involved with clinical trials and stroke trials. From there, what brought me here to El Paso was in 2013 was they were looking for a chair to start a new department of neurology, and I applied, and the driving force was, one, I was going to start a department in a place where they hardly had any neurology at all. And second, I was going to be helping and providing access to people to neurologic care that look just like me. Mm-hmm. And so that was and so I'm starting from a different point than Dr. Ochoa, and that I needed to build first the infrastructure of providing care for patients, because if I don't have patients, neurological patients to care for, then I won't have patients to actually enroll in clinical trials. And many of these clinical trials, at least in stroke, which is my specialty, had to do mostly with acute stroke, although we have a lot of trials also in prevention of stroke. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder to you that, and this is a picture taken from the magazine, The Economist, and it was several years ago, just to tell you what the makeup of the U.S. And how the Hispanic population is represented. The darker Browns is probably the heaviest concentration of Hispanic people. As it becomes lighter, you can see, but you can see that mostly it's in the south end of the country, and also in the Florida, with some little pieces of Hispanic population here and there in the rest of America. Next. More importantly, it was estimated, and actually by now we're probably the largest minority in the U.S. By 250, really, we're going to be predominant. So we're not only the largest minority, but we'll become even larger as the years go by, and that brings important issues in terms of potential racial disparities in care. And if you have racial disparities in care, chances are you're going to have racial disparities in access to research. Next. To tell you a bit about El Paso, I'll tell you where it is in a second. It's about 900 inhabitants, 85% Hispano-Latinx. About 60–70% of people speak Spanish as a native language. About 40% of people are bilingual. And our sister city across the border is Ciudad Juárez, which is about 1.2 million. We're at the closest, we are the academic center in about, I don't know, 300 miles around. The closest one is Albuquerque in New Mexico, about 4.5 hours driving. And there are only about 24 by now neurologists in town. The city has about 1,200 hospital beds. And I'm working at the University Medical Center where I see patients. Although I'm an employee of Texas Tech, we provide most of the care for this hospital, which is a level 1 trauma care, and also a comprehensive stroke center. The only one in the city. It's a county hospital. It has many nicknames, and I'm not going to go into that. Birthplace of Margarita, if you're interested. Anyway, next slide. We are the only place, just to put you in context, El Paso is probably the most western part of Texas. And just to put it in context and the size of Texas, if we drive, we're a little closer to San Diego than we are to Houston. So that large. Wow. And then if you see the slide to your the picture in the left-hand side, is the concentration of stroke centers. And you can see this Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and then Laredo and Rio Grande Valley, and then Houston. Most of it represent the Highway 35. Most of it, the western Texas, west to Highway 35, you can see that it's pretty devoid of care, neurologic care and stroke care, and we are where the star is here. So that's where Texas is in El Paso. We're the only city in Texas that are in actually mountain time. Next slide. Talking about disparities, and this is important considering the growth of the Hispanic population and also the color population in general, is that disparities cost a lot to the government. The expenditures that have been estimated in almost $230 billion in the years between 2003 and 2006. So if this was about almost like 20 years ago, you can imagine what the cost will be if disparities continue to continue to exist with no fixing. And here I'm talking about not only care, but also access to research. And I tell you what the importance of having Hispanic participate in research, not only as subjects, individuals that receive treatment, or are part of the research project, but also about the researchers that actually, the Hispanic researchers that are involved in. Next slide. So this is just another piece of information that is becoming important, which is not only the fact that is the possibility of racial disparities, but also the issue of social determinants of health that had to do with the socioeconomic status of racial and ethnic minorities, people of color. This is just a map and there are maps of different cities. You can find this in VCU where there are maps of actually mortality related to where you live and the city that you live. This is El Paso, and you can see based on what highway or close to what highway. This is central El Paso, where you see 70, the life expectancy is 71. But as you move east or west, you can see that the life expectancy, just by virtue of where you live, that's an important, impacts what your health status is going to be, and your life expectancy, and therefore the mortality. Next slide. So imagine me, I accepted a position as chair in a small department. I'm the founding chair, and you arrive the first day, and I have only 2 faculty and 1 nurse practitioner, and I hardly had any presence in the hospital, a very small practice, and I'm supposed to start, I have some students rotating with me, and I'm asking myself, what the hell did I do to myself here? It's just, I don't know how I'm going to start this. So the initial idea is, well, I need to have the niche, the place where I can actually start taking care of patients, so we can start attracting people that require neurologic care. And by doing so, then I have those people that I can provide. I can be the liaison to actually get them into clinical trials for stroke prevention, for acute stroke care, and for other neurologic diseases like treatment for with different anti-epileptics in the case of epilepsy and so on. Next slide. My department, after 12 years, I mean, it grew into now we are about 11 faculty. It says 9 here, but now 11 faculty. I have about 10 nurse practitioners. I started a residency program, which is important in terms of educating and try to nurturing people. We've graduated so far about 6 cohorts of residents. That is about 18 residents total since we started. We just recruited a child neurologist. We have an intensive care unit for neurocritical care. We just opened an epilepsy monitoring unit, and we're providing care. Having that as the origin or the beginning of it, then we were in a possibility to perhaps start participating in clinical trials and provide access to those patients. Next slide. The research and measure as the number of publications. You can see the years and how the number of publications grew for the department. I'm not going to dwell into that. And this was up to 2017. There are even more publications since then. Keep going. Next slide. And then why is it important for us to not only have researchers that are minorities, but also patients, subjects that we willing to participate as patients in clinical trials? Well, we know, for instance, in stroke that antiplatelets like aspirin, Plavix, and medications are helpful for stroke prevention. We know that some anticoagulants are useful to prevent strokes and atrial fibrillation. We know certain procedures can be done to open up carotid arteries for stroke prevention. We know that we can use the clot buster TPA or TNK for management acute stroke. We know about stroke units, now a mechanical thrombectomy, try to open up blood vessels with procedures and so on. And we assume that the knowledge is generalizable. Next slide. The question is, does that apply to me? Does that result apply to me? So if I have a stroke and I take aspirin or Plavix, the results of the trials that were done, do they really reflect my same life experience? Keep going. Next slide. Or does it apply to any of these people? For instance, just as face value, are you going to treat the same? Are you going to treat me the same? Or are you going to treat him the same? Or are you going to treat him the same? Or the treatments, are they applied the same to this patient or to this patient or to this patient? And the answer is that we don't know. We assume just by the average, the law of averages, that the results may be applicable to all of us. But that may not be necessarily true. Next slide. So the importance then is that there is variability in age and biological sex, the pregnancy status, genetic variations, and so on. And then we have aspects of life experiences. Just the other part is that even if I participate as a Hispanic, and if I live in an area at deprived socioeconomic status, and I participate in a clinical trial, am I going to have the same response than somebody that is of my same ethnic group, but lives in a more affluent area? And so there are many other issues that go beyond the biological characteristics that we have that may have an impact in how we respond to treatment, not only during clinical trials, but even as the result of clinical trials are actually released, proving that one medication may be effective and so on. Next slide. So the lack of diversity then, it compromises the generalizability of the results. It may cost us a lot of billions of dollars, as I just show you, because either you won't have access to that care. For instance, right now, I know that we all know that mechanical thrombectomy is useful to treat acute strokes, to open up the blood vessel. But guess what? Not all of us have the same access because not all of us live close enough to hospitals that actually can deliver that care. So, and therefore, and if we don't have individuals that participate as subjects of investigation, then we won't know. If I don't participate in the clinical trials as a Hispanic individual and subject, I won't know if the response of a particular treatment will be the same in people that look like me as opposed to a white person or an African American and so on. So that may lead eventually to lack of access. That's fine, you can keep these. Why is this important? Because if you look at these numbers in terms of participations of subjects of being participants of clinical trials that are enrolled in clinical trials, you can see that the number of people of Hispanic people that participate in clinical trials, at least up to 2018, is less than 10%. So if you have a cancer drug, if you have a neurological medication, you have whatever treatment that is Parkinson's or for hepatitis, whatever the disease that you're studying, if you have people that are underrepresented, the results may not be applicable to that particular group of people, even when a medication may prove, and the average, to be more effective. Next slide. Interestingly enough, up until a few years ago, we know that 50% of the clinical trials do not report the race of people that participate. About up to 15 of the clinical trials do not report what is the socioeconomic status of people that participate. And we know that the allostatic load, the socioeconomic condition of patients, may affect also how they respond to drugs, or even whether they would have access to them. Interestingly enough, this idea that Hispanics or people of color do not want to participate in clinical trials might be just a myth, because at least in phase 1 trials, studied by in some of these references here, 2/3 of patients that are included in phase 1 studies for medications are actually in minority groups. So this idea that this myth, if you will, that minorities do not want to be included may not be real. But the other important part here, the subtitle of this is, if people of minority groups are participating in phase 1 trials, you have to ask yourself, why aren't they being given access to phase 3? Why is this important? Because phase 1 trials are not aimed necessarily at improving the life of a person. They're more to trying to find out what the safety of the medication is before we even know whether the medication is actually effective. Trials in phase 3 are aimed at actually try to prove whether it's actually an effective medication. And interestingly enough, in those trials, we may see less participation. Next slide. So these are some of the barriers of participation. Some of them had to do with really access, as Dr. Ochoa mentioned, how close to the patient it is, fears of exploitation, lack of trust, financial constraints, etc., fears of unintended outcomes, stigmatization, and so on. And for many of us Hispanics, the language and culture concordant is also important. Next slide. So this is kind of just the take-home message. The diversity is increasing. The lack of representation increases. It may cost a lot of money and a lot of human lives. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to actually increase. Now, that is another sub message, and I think Dr. Rios made an allusion to this. About 6% of physicians practicing in the U.S. are Hispanics. Sadly enough, in academic medicine, with data from the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, only about 6% of medical students or residents that are in different training programs are actually Hispanic. And so how is it that we can actually increase the pipeline? So I'm just going to leave you with this. Why is this important in terms of cultural concordance? I'll just tell you what Mandela used to say. In terms of cultural concordance and being able to care for somebody that looks like one or enroll them in clinical trials, Mandela would say that if you talk to a man in a language that he can understand, that goes to his head. But if you talk to a man in a language and his own language and his native language, that goes to his heart. And so it is certainly different when you're actually communicating with somebody that actually has a lot of, that is akin to you, that looks like you. And so with that message, I leave you. Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Rios, again.
Great. Thank you very much. Both of you have been outstanding in terms of your insights and sharing some of your wisdom through the years, obviously many years that both of you have treated our communities and our population, but have also been involved in understanding how to meet the challenges, and despite the challenges, been successful in your research careers. Just a few questions that we have, and please let me remind everyone, if you have some questions, please type them in the Q&A box. I know there's a lot of people chatting back and forth in the chat box, but we need the Q&A box for questions. So here's a question, and if you want to both answer, that's fine. What have you seen as best practices for working with community networks? For example, family advocacy networks or patient advocacy networks, not just individuals. And this is a very creative question, because I don't know if you even deal with advocacy organizations, and if you think that there is a need to think about a partnership or a collaboration with your research teams to increase awareness about clinical trials in your cities where you're at. Dr. Ochoa, you want to answer that first?
So we do work with advocacy groups. Not only do we have patient advocates present in our discussions and our clinical trials programs, but we also work with advocacy groups because they really, frankly, they are the ones that guide us for the programs that we call the community outreach programs. Part of the of leading successful clinical trials is having appropriate community outreach. And as Dr. Salvador Cruz-Flores was saying, educating or sharing with the public why it's important to, why clinical trials are important and why you're not just being brought as an experimental mouse, or we're not conducting an experiment on you, but we're offering you the latest and the greatest today of what is going to be approved tomorrow. So I think that working with advocacy groups, it's important. Now, each one, since I mentioned before, we have many sites throughout the state, and what is important is that each one of those sites has access to their own advocacy groups in their neighborhoods, in their towns, in their regions, and they can be parent-teacher association, there can be social clubs, they can be a whole variety of organizations that are not necessarily patient advocacy groups necessarily, but are social groups that really bring the message and help us spread the message in the community, so that when the patient and their family comes to look for oncology services, in our case, they're already prepared and say, I heard that clinical trials are important. Is there something that we should be thinking about, even though this is their first visit? So yes, working with advocacy groups is important. I don't think we do it in a systematic manner, but rather let our sites look for the advocacy groups that are closest to them.
Dr. Cruz-Flores, would you like to answer that?
I just echo what Dr. Ochoa mentioned, in that I think the basic message is that you have to meet people where they are. And sometimes ivory towers aren't necessarily the most friendly places for people to actually get close to. And so sometimes to have intermediaries that can actually expand and distribute your message, that can actually walk with you to actually make contact with these patients. I remember in St. Louis, I worked also with minorities and participated in clinical trials for African Americans. For instance, the African American stroke prevention study and some others. And African Americans in particular, it was important to actually go to their churches and actually approach them there for participation and provide information and education about the clinical trials and dispel the fears that patient may have about being experimented on and so on. The same thing for Hispanics. I mean, we're family-oriented people. Oftentimes you have a family that comes with patients. So advocacy groups that are closer to patients are an important part of getting close to them.
Very
And
good.
if I may add to what Dr. Cruz-Flores said, I'll give you an example of how these advocacy groups teach us how patients approach this. We had a clinical trial on erectile dysfunction for patients who had prostate cancer, and we thought that there would be hundreds of patients lining up to work with us. The first 6 months, we had nobody line up to work with us. And so, as Dr. Cruz-Flores said, we went to the churches and talked with them, and still we didn't have anybody until in a breast cancer screening program, one of our nurses was talking with a patient, and the patient said, "You're doing this the wrong way. We'll help you with this." And they went to their church meeting, and the next week, the women had lined up all their men who had prostate cancer to participate on the clinical study.
That's yeah, that's great. We have a few comments in the chat. I'm going back and forth with the chat and Q&A. But one question was for the NHHF, and I would ask you both to comment on this. We are very focused on the importance of reaching beyond just doctors and going into the world of IMGs, international medical grads, physician associates, nurses, and having a more interdisciplinary approach to help our communities increase awareness about career pathways, but to research in this case, right? And one of the comments was that Carlos Sanchez is saying that he's actually developing a graduate program and curriculum on science clinical trials. And his comment has to do with the importance of curriculum considering representation in clinical trials. This may be out of your box because you're so involved with doing clinical trials, but have you in your institutions, have you run across this barrier of not having enough support for Latinos to get into clinical trials in your clinical trial training programs, if you have training programs or perhaps grants? There's so few Latino doctors as it is, or medical students and residents, but just how do you see we can meet the challenge of increasing more of the few into research?
That's a
Dr. Cruz. Yeah.
that's a pretty tough question, and like it has to do with I mean, you made a allusion to that with the data from AMA, and then I complemented with the AAMC. I think part of the problem that we have is, for instance, in neurology, we have a similar problem. I mean, only about 5% of people in medical school go to neurology, and Interestingly enough, you have about 30% of people that are actually in practice and primary practice and underserved areas, or in neurology in particular. 30% of people that are out there in practice are foreign medical graduates. And so neurology in particular has been struggling with trying to grow the pipeline. But trying to grow the pipeline means, well, let's increase the number of medical students interested, number one, in going to medical school, number two, going and to the neurosciences. For the past, I can remember, I don't know, 5 to 8 years, that we haven't been able to move the needle.
Yeah.
What is catastrophic is that the number of people with neurologic disease is increasing. And so what are we going to do with people not having access to care or access to research? So several avenues. One is you include maybe advanced practice practitioners, like nurse practitioners or physician assistants, that can expand or help and not only in clinical care, but also in access to research. Nowadays, we are engaged, for instance, with there is the Lone Star Stroke Consortium, which is a group of stroke researchers from the main universities. We are included in that. We're part of the executive committee for that. Baylor, UT Houston, San Antonio, we're all included. And some of our research projects had to do with some that Dr. Ochoa already made allusion to, which is doing some of the research, in this particular case, for instance, rehabilitation by doing tele-rehab virtually. And now technology has facilitated providing that access. Now, as to in the short term, how to increase the number of Hispanic and representation of people that look like us, that can actually stimulate or encourage more people actually getting into research from the pipeline. Maybe organizations like medical schools, maybe organizations like medical societies of specific specialties, particular crisis. And there was a couple of pieces in JAMA about this in terms of the international medical graduate. Maybe there is a need to increase the number of visas for people to come and help in practice and provide the access that we don't have. And so, but that's a longer discussion. I'm sorry.
Well, let me just say that one of the other questions to you all, and because you might know, being especially Dr. Cruz-Flores on the border, their NAFTA developed a visa called the TN visa for research, and it is for IMGs from Mexico and Canada, because NAFTA is the the treaty for the three countries, United States, Canada, and Mexico. But have you had any experience with international medical graduates from Mexico being able to do research because they're getting these TN visas? Or do they know about them? That's something that we are interested in increasing awareness.
You just, Dr. Rios, you just increase awareness. I did not know about it.
Okay. We will send information to everybody on this call and let more people know about this incredible tool to allow doctors that are here trying to get their license, right, in the United States. So they may be at a stage where they have to pass exams, or they have to get a residency, preceptorship, and they can actually start working in research,
And that's the only, because we're more concerned, the university is more concerned to trying to get people to come and practice, I think, is more the pathway about the J1 waivers and so on for people that did the training here. I wasn't acquainted with that, but if you have information, by all means, there are a lot of people that are interested in coming and doing research, and for one reason or the other, there are a lot of institutional barriers to it because of particularly immigration status.
Okay, well, it may be a university issue. Yes, Dr. Ochoa.
I think the other part is that we need to start thinking and training and talking about clinical trials, not as something you do already as an established doctor who's practiced for many years, but we need to start educating people from the undergraduate programs. Participating in research, clinical research is not just limited to the laboratories where we do mouse experiments or in vitro experiments. Learning how to participate in a clinical trial can be very successful, even for undergraduate students. We have had post-baccalaureate students who learn how to become a clinical trials coordinator, and they work with our research nurses in a very successful way. The person who's really spearheaded this is a breast cancer leader, Dr. Victoria Seawald at City of Hope, and she has had an extraordinary group of post-baccalaureate students, including many Hispanics, who have finished their undergraduate, need a few more years under their belt to be able to pass their exams so they can get into medical school. And they tend to be the most outstanding clinical trials coordinators because they don't want to be laboratory researchers. They want to be where the patients are. And so I think in that stage, we can start getting people interested in what is a clinical trial and how you participate in.
Great. I know we're going to run out of time. I really just wanted to say that there are a few questions about the importance of reaching community. And for example, and I'll just use the one example that comes up a couple of times here is community clinics. And you mentioned the importance of having connections to community clinics. Can you give one piece of advice on what to do or maybe what not to do when you're an academician trying to connect clinical trials? I mean, to community health, clinics about your clinical trial work.
So as we've all said throughout this presentation, you've got to meet everybody where they are and what their needs are and understand that. And I think part of the conversation in these clinics is not this paternalistic thing of we're the ivory tower, we're coming to you with a solution. It's rather, tell me about your practice and what you're doing, and let's see how we can work together to improve the outcomes for patients. And then you can say it has to be a win-win situation. It cannot be, I'm coming here to get your patient so I can complete the study. It's actually, I'm coming here so we can offer your patients the best that we can offer them. And here's how I can facilitate your work and why you're going to improve the lives of your patients. So it has to be a win-win situation. We have great examples of that using this virtual research nurse tool that I mentioned before. And I'm hoping that at some point we can publish that and have it expanded to other sites.
Great. Well, I have to thank everybody that's been on the call with us tonight. Again, the National Hispanic Health Foundation is very focused on developing a National Center for Hispanic Research, Health Research, and we don't see us as doing the training. We want to work with you all who are the clinicians out there doing the clinical trials. We would like to figure our role as increasing the collaboration with those who do research so that we can find younger people to work with you or to find mentoring and awareness building, especially as was mentioned at younger ages, through conferences that already happen around the country that might be pre-med conferences or pre-nursing conferences. I'll say health career conferences, and bring speakers to those conferences about the importance of research. So we're looking for speakers, we're looking for mentors, and I would just say someone asked how to give us your CV, send it to our main email, which is nhhf@nhhfx.org. We will have a more, we're getting a new grant to develop our capacity, kind of an infrastructure grant to develop our databases. And like I said, we did work with we met with the AAMC this morning on a partnership just to help. They will help us find a way to get more awareness among the faculty and residents and medical students of the importance of clinical research among the Latino community and finding more Latinos that are interested in research. Someone just mentioned on the chat that the scan is not working, and someone else suggested taking a picture and scanning it with another phone. But we will send everyone on this call an email with the information on our links to our. It's really a link to the webinar, post webinar, we have a link to our website, and we have information about the CME. So we will definitely send it all in an email. And sorry about that scan not working. And I just want to say that we will be doing another webinar in January, probably the end of January. And it was suggested that perhaps we start looking at a more inclusive meeting of interaction rather than just lectures. But I think what's important is that we have experts like Dr. Ochoa and Dr. Cruz-Flores that are very valuable to sharing their knowledge, and that's why we do it this way. But if we can, I say we try it, and have more of an interaction rather than so much, presentation. But I think the presentations are really valuable. We do have a YouTube where we have saved all the webinars. We have been doing webinars now for 3 years, quarterly webinars. And we're very thankful to our sponsors, the EQBMED, for this quarterly webinar series this year. And we hope to have other sponsors, and maybe we have even more webinars for younger people, like medical students talking about what they like about getting involved in research, instead of just the experts talking about research. But we're very interested in increasing Latinos in medicine and in health careers, and whatever we can do. I'm in Washington, D.C. Our office is in D.C., but I'm from California, and I know how hard it is to get people to come to D.C. But I just want to give a plug for another thing that we're doing at the National Hispanic Health Foundation is we are nominating experts in different fields to the advisory committees of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Secretary Becerra has actually acknowledged our work over the last year, and we have nominated doctors who are getting, we are increasing the diversity at those levels where reports are made and changes come from the vision of the experts on advisory committees to all of the NIH departments, all the HRSA programs, all the CDC programs. So I encourage everyone to keep in touch, and again, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you for the audience, and especially thank you, Lillian, for keeping our slides going. and I think it was a great hour. Thank you all very much.